Ok, bienvenidos. Somos los Spanish Speaking Acousticians in the Americas, un capítulo regional de la ASA, de la Acoustical Society of America. Nuestra misión es congregar y conectar a los profesionales y estudiantes de la acústica y el sonido en el área geográfica de América Latina. El capítulo actúa como nexo entre la Acoustical Society of America o la ASA y los hispanoparlantes interesados en la acústica y el sonido, desarrollando y divulgando actividades de interés para sus miembros. Eh, un poco de temas, eh, digamos, de negocios. Eh, Se pueden unir al capítulo por este link. Si estás interesado en hacer parte de la junta directiva y ayudar a organizar estos eventos, por favor escríbenos a nuestro Gmail y puedes tomar parte activa. Hay varias formas de unirse a la Acoustical Society of America como miembro. Hay CE Associate, que es un tipo de membresía que es específicamente para países en desarrollo. Te da muchos de los beneficios que hay y los materiales en Internet que tenemos a un precio reducido de $50 por año. Aquí está la junta directiva. Somos los que coordinamos estos eventos y trabajamos para que ustedes puedan disfrutar de la sociedad. Aquí están nuestras redes. Nos pueden seguir en Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Gmail. Y bueno, visítanos. Ok, ahora vamos a dar comienzo con la presentación. Esta es la percepción y medición de calidad sonora en audífonos por Sean Olive. Voy a dar una introducción acá. I'm going to switch to English for this part. Um, and Sean Olive is a senior fellow at Harman, where he has conducted research in the perception and measurement of sound quality in loudspeakers, headphones, rooms, and automotive audio since 1993. Prior to 1993, he was a research scientist in acoustics at the National Research Council of Canada, where he worked with Dr. Floyd Toole. Sean has published over 50 research papers and 3 book chapters, for which he has received several awards, including the AES Fellowship, and is also a past president of the AES. He is a technical reviewer for the Acoustical Society of America and the Audio Engineering Society, and an avid educator, having taught audio courses at McGill, UCLA, CETIA, and Harman University. And without further ado, Sean, I'm going to let you share your screen again, and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Can you see my
Yes.
screen?
Yep, we see it.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, thanks for that introduction. And my talk today is going to be basically a very quick summary of some research we've been doing over the last few years. And the research, you can find these papers, most of them are in the AES, some of them are elsewhere. But over the course of the last 7+ years, we've published over 19 papers. There's a book chapter coming out on headphones and number of patents and so on. But the motivation behind this research was, we started this back in 2012. And at that time, headphones became suddenly very popular, largely because music had migrated to the internet. Digital audio was pretty well established. It was distributed through there. And then the invention of the iPhone and the iPod, suddenly you could carry this portable device around with you and listen to music anywhere at any time. But the headphones that came with these devices were often not very good. So this basically filled a need in the industry to start selling headphone replacements so you could listen to audio wherever you happen to be. And, Todd Welty, who's a colleague of mine, we started to measure headphones and we found that the quality was quite poor. And there was no consistency or continuity between different brands or even different models within the same brand. And then we looked at the scientific literature and we found that there hadn't really been any research done since the late 80s, early 90s. Uh, so, um, so anyways, there was this need for more scientific guidance on how to design headphones for best sound. And there was a guy named Johan Breibart in 2017. He published a paper in the Journal of the Acoustical Society, and the title was No Correlation Between Headphone Frequency Response and Retail Price. And what he did was he measured 283 different headphones on a standard test fixture. All three types, circumoral, supraoral, and in-ear. And he showed that this dotted line was the mean response of all headphones he tested. And then he looked at what was the preferred target response at that time from Harman. And he looked at the root mean square. So how much did the response of headphones deviate as in terms of the Harman target or in terms of the mean response of that sample size? And he found that the error, there was no correlation between the price of the headphone and how much that headphone deviated from the average or what was considered good at the time, which was the Harman target. So this was clear evidence that the industry has no clear guidance or there's no consensus on how to make a headphone sound good. And this was all strictly based on measurements, but we'd actually started doing listening tests. That's what the Harman target is based on, and we came to similar conclusions. So what is the Harman target curve? It's basically a preferred frequency response that if you design a headphone on the proper test fixture and it meets this target, in general, it will please the vast majority of people. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And what it approximates is the steady state frequency response of a neutral loudspeaker if you put it in a semi-reflective listening room and measured it at the eardrum reference point. So if you put a mannequin, in a room, take a good loudspeaker and measure it, the headphone response measured at that eardrum point will look just like a really good loudspeaker. And, there's a lot of, this is sort of what it looks like. And I often get texts from people saying, this hill, this happens to be a hill close to where I live in Newbury Park. And it has the topography or the shape of this looks a lot like the Harman target curve. That's just coincidence. We didn't, that wasn't our guidance when we decided what this curve was. How we how we derived it was as I said, we went into what we call our reference room. It's just an average size room with semi-reflective with an average reverberation time of less than 0.4 seconds. And we took an anechoically flat loudspeaker, put it in the room. We used multiple subwoofers to get a very good low frequency response. And then we did a spatial average, moving this mannequin at 3 different angles. And when you take an average, it looks a lot like this curve that I showed you. And that becomes the baseline of the Harman target. And then we did a lot of listening experiments where people would further adjust the treble and the bass to what they considered their preference or their taste. And this is what it looks like in terms of a frequency response. And this is measured on a standard 711 ear coupler. So this bump you see at 3 kilohertz is actually, it's simulating the ear canal resonance and the pinna. It's an open ear response, so it includes the head, the pinna, in the ear canal. And if you equalize the speaker in the room to be flat, that's the dotted green curve. And then if you ask people to adjust it to their preference, they'll increase the bass and reduce the treble. And this is in fact what the speaker would look like in the room if you didn't equalize it to be flat. And what that green curve is actually, it closely approximates the current standard in headphone standards in what they consider to be the ideal frequency response, which is the diffuse field. And you're going to see data that I'm going to show that tells us that this current standard, which is supposedly how we're supposed to design headphones, is not preferred. It's considered to be too thin in the bass and too bright in the treble. So the current standard is basically a flawed standard, and no one really follows it in the industry. So this is what there's different standards for headphone test fixtures. This happens to be one based on the 711. It's made by Grass. It's called the Grass 45 CE. It's actually, I can't see my slide because yeah. So this is actually what it looks like. And you'll notice, let me go back. You'll notice that this is the current standard. So it has a anthropomorphic ear and it's very pliable. So it's very flexible. So when you put a headphone on it, the ear collapses and it's very similar to a human ear, an average human ear, which is a good thing. But when we started our research, this is the standard pinna that came with the Grass coupler. It was the previous version of the pinna, and it was very stiff. You can see it sticks out from the test fixture, so it would cause this constant gap between the ear, the microphone, and the headphone. And this was a real problem because it would cause leakage, and if you have a closed headphone that has this leak in it, it's not going to have any bass. And we actually found out in our first listening tests where we would have people listen to the actual headphones that some people would say this headphone has great bass, some people would say it doesn't have any bass. And when you actually measure the headphone on the person, it turns out that this variance in bass was caused by how well the headphone fit and sealed on the person's ear. So this is a real critical nuisance variable in headphone uh, objective measurements as well as subjective measurements. If you don't control for these leakage effects, you're going to get very noisy data, and it'll be hard to come up with what's a considered a standard or a well-accepted target curve. So Todd Welty did some work. My colleague Todd Welty did some work where he went out and published. He measured headphones on a bunch of people, and then he modified this pinna so that it didn't stick out. He changed the hardness of it so it was more flexible, and it turns out that it's very close to what the current Grass pinna represents. So we had this target curve, which I've explained, and then we wanted to actually validate it to see whether people like it or not. And we did these tests, listening tests in 4 different countries. We wanted to, see whether preference in sound varies from culture to culture. We wanted to look at whether preference varies, whether you're trained or an untrained listener. And then we looked at things like gender. And these locations happen to be, with the exception of Canada, we have all these other locations. We have locations, Harman locations, where we have both trained and untrained listeners. So we took our target curve at that time. This was 2013. We compared it to what were considered at the time 3 really good headphones. One was this Sennheiser HD800, which is a over-ear open back headphone, we had the Audis LCT2, which is a very expensive magnetic planar headphone. And then finally, we had one of the best-selling headphones at the time, which was the Beats by Dre Studio. This is a closed-back dynamic headphone, which at the time it was one of the top-selling headphones. And our marketing department thought that we should just copy this headphone, copy its sound. And I argued that, well, the reason it's the number one selling headphone is not because of the sound, but because they've got great marketing. And if we want to copy their marketing, then we probably get very good sales. But let's see if we remove the marketing factor from the test, whether it's the sound or not. So we designed these blind listening tests where we could take a standard neutral headphone, we could equalize it to match the frequency response of these headphones. And using a single set of headphones, we could compare or virtualize any headphone that we had measured. And we did a lot of studies validating to see whether this gave us similar results as actually listening to the actual headphone, and there was very high correlation. So we feel confident that although these results are blind and well controlled, that they're representative of what you would get if you were blinded but listening to the actual headphone. So this is the method. We have a replicator headphone. You switch between A, B, C, D. Each one of these is one of those headphones, and we're simply applying a digital filter to simulate, or it's a very close match to what we measured on our test fixture. So people went through a series of trials, listening to 3 different music tracks, and they would rate each headphone on a 10-point scale according to preference. And these are the results. The results on the left represent trained listeners from different Harman locations, and the results on the right-hand side represent results from different groups of untrained listeners in 4 different countries. And you can see there's a similarity in the overall trends. The most preferred headphone, HP1, is the Harman Target. HP4 was the least preferred headphone, which was the Beats headphone. And you can see there are common results between each groups of people. What you can see with the untrained listeners is there's much more noise in the data. They're less discriminating. They're not able to discriminate between the 4 headphones as well as the trained listeners, but the overall trends and preferences are very similar. So we don't really need to design a headphone for untrained people because their tastes are pretty similar. There's also similarities between different countries. And you can see this in the next graph. You can see that listening experience doesn't have much of an effect, except that people with a lot of listening experience tend to be more discriminating. You can see that headphone preferences are pretty similar across different countries or cultures. And you can see that preferences are pretty constant regardless of age. The one exception is people over 55 tended to like headphone 2 a little more, and this is the headphone that tends to have less bass and more treble. So we didn't test for hearing, audiometry hearing thresholds, but it's likely that their age has something to do with this preference for a brighter headphone. It's probably related to hearing loss. We also did experiments where we gave them the baseline Harman target curve, and then they went through a series of 5 trials where they could adjust the bass and treble of the headphone according to taste. And they could do this over a range of 20 dB in the bass and similar type of range in the treble. And we would randomize the level of the bass and treble in each trial, and they would simply adjust it in 40 dB increments. And these are the mean results and standard 95% confidence intervals. And these adjustments are from what would be the baseline flat headphone, the diffuse field response. So on average, people would increase the bass about 6.5 dB and reduce the treble by 1.4 dB. So they don't like the diffuse field response, the current standard. They want a little more bass and quite a bit more bass and less treble. This is what they consider to be neutral. These are the results with 3 different music tracks, and you can see that your taste or what settings you prefer depends on the music. That I think has largely to do with the fact that in the recording industry, we have really no standards on what monitors and how they're calibrated. Every recording studio, especially in the music industry, there tends to be, standards that aren't followed. In the film industry, I think there are standards, and people tend to follow them a little better than they do in the music industry. You can see that the preferred bass and treble adjustments vary from gender. And unfortunately, our sample size for females is a little small, but on average, they prefer slightly less bass and less treble than males. And again, we found that where people set these bass and treble levels is not really, doesn't change much from country to country. So what is considered good sound is pretty universal, and that's reassuring that we don't need to design headphones or audio products in general for different cultural tastes. And again, this is an interesting finding. You can see as the age of the listener, as they go from 15 to 25 to over 56, there's a fairly systematic decrease in the bass and an increase in the treble. And again, this could be related to age. As you get older, you have presbycusis, which is less sensitivity at higher frequencies. And reducing the bass or increasing the treble could be a compensation for that. There could also be younger people may prefer more bass. That may be a generational thing. There's other studies that have shown that young males, for example, like to increase the bass in their cars, and it could be related to their a personality thing. And again, listening experience has a little effect. As the more experience, you tend to like a little less bass than people with less experience. This was a paper where we did a study where 130 people rated 31 different over-ear headphones. And the results were then analyzed using a cluster analysis where you look at clusters or segments of people based on similarities in what headphones they like. And we looked at how many clusters are there and what are the acoustic features of these clusters, and are there any demographic factors associated with each class. And it turns out with these headphones, we found basically 3 clusters. By the largest one included 64% of the listeners, and then there were 2 smaller clusters, one being 15% and the other one 22% of the listeners. And the way we looked at what were the common features among these classes, we looked at it in terms of the headphones that they preferred, and we expressed it in terms of how far their 5 most preferred headphones deviated from the Harman target. So if they like the Harman target, the deviation would be 0. The error curve would basically be flat over as a function of frequency, basically 0. And if the error curve drooped in the bass, that means they like less bass in the treble. And if it has a positive error in the bass, that means they like more bass than the Harman target. So the largest class 1, 64% of the listeners, you can see that in general, this deviates the least from the Harman target. Class 3, which accounts for 22% of the listeners, these people tend to like about 2 to 3 dB less bass than the Harman target. And then the smallest class 2, these are people that on average tend to like, 4 to 6 dB more bass than the Harman target. So it's clear that people like the Harman target, but there's certainly opportunities for slight adjustments to the bass and treble to accommodate these differences in taste. And looking at the, the demographic profiles, you can see that the largest class includes all categories of gender, training, trained, untrained. But there were fewer people over the age of 50 years old. The smallest class 2, tend to be male, younger listeners, and these are the people that prefer more bass than the Harman target. And then the class 3, 21% of the people, they tended to be untrained listeners. There were a disproportionate percentage of females and people over the age of 50 years. And these people have a sound profile where they prefer 2 to 3 dB less bass and slightly more treble. So, one of our headphones, the Mark Levinson, this is one of our luxury headphones. It's designed to the Harman target, but it has this feature where you can change the bass contour, which would, depending on which class of listeners you fall in, you can leave it alone to the Harman target, that's the default, or you can decrease the bass or increase the bass. And future versions of this headphone will also have a treble adjustment. So one of the motivations was to see whether we could predict listener preference ratings based on objective measurements, so that we can very quickly assess how a headphone would score during its design without having to run these listening tests, which, as you can imagine, are very time consuming and expensive. You have to run 10 to 20 different listeners, and it takes quite a bit of time and effort. So taking the data that we had from all the listening tests, we found that people generally, the top scoring headphones tended to have on average, this blue curve. So it's very close to the Harman target. The air response was generally close to 0. And headphones that fell in the category of 65 to 76% based on preference ratings tended to deviate slightly more. And as you go down to the category of headphone scoring between 0 to 39%, you can see it largely even more deviates from the Harman target curve. In this case, it's got too much bass over quite a wide bandwidth, has less treble. So there's a clear visual correlation between how much a headphone deviates from the Harman target, which is represented by the air response curve, and how it will be scored. So we came up with two metrics. So we measure the headphone, we calculate the air response curve, which is simply the difference between the response of the headphone and the target curve. And we have these two metrics, the standard deviation and the absolute value of the slope of that air curve. And we're able to predict the preference rating with a correlation of 0.86 with a error of about 6.7 on a scale from 0 to 100. So that's a pretty good. We have a model for in-ear headphones that comes even closer. It's over 90% correlation, but it's a fairly good indicator of how the headphone would be scored in a listening test just based on measurements. So some caveats here. The Harman target curve has become a sort of an industry guideline. You'll see it quoted a lot at various headphone review sites, but it's always important to remember that it's not perfect and it doesn't account for various things, and it has limitations. For example, it doesn't include corrections for which segment or class you fall into. It doesn't consider nonlinear distortion, which in most of our tests, distortion was not a factor. And you should always remember that it's only a guideline or a reference, which will help you, hit the largest segment of people, 64%, but there's always room for optimization for a different segment. I just want to talk a little bit now about measuring headphones on humans versus test fixtures, because the assumption is that the test fixtures are very accurate simulations of how the headphone would measure on a human. And it turns out that that's not always the case. So this was just a little study I did where I took 9 headphones. 4 of them were open back models, so they have a built-in leak. They're going to be more resistant to leakage effects, and which means they're more likely to be more consistent at low frequencies. And then we have closed back models where the headphone design is generally relying on a good seal to get good bass. And it means that the fit and the seal is, the more consistent it is within and across listeners, the more likely it will produce good results and have similar results on test fixtures. So we took these 9 headphones and we measured them on different humans, people that work in our lab or outside our lab, and we did closed, we put little microphones at the entrance of the ear canal, so it's a blocked ear canal measurement. And we had them put these headphones on 5 times and measured the average. And you can see that for open back designs, you get this kind of variation. This is the mean of the 5 repeats. But you can see that there's fairly good agreement across the listeners, except at very high frequencies. In terms of bass, there's some variance. But if you look at the closed back designs, you can see that there's quite a lot of variance, especially at low frequencies. Your opinion of this headphone may vary dramatically depending on which listener you are and how well it seals. So this is something you should be aware of. And in all of our research, we always tried to carefully control for seal and leakage effects. But when you're actually designing a headphone, you want to ensure that that the design is going to minimize these kinds of leakage effects. So you can see the variance. This is for the 9 different models, and you can see a pattern here where the closed backs tend to have very high variance at low frequencies. With the exception of one model here, this black model is a very good in terms of consistent fit and leakage. The open backs have very low variance, and at higher frequencies, there tends to be also a lot of variance, because because the headphone is interacting with your pinna, and depending on how you position it and place it, you're going to see some variation. So this basically just summarizes the standard deviation for open back. And in our case, this was motivated by choosing a headphone that would be good for 3D audio research, where you're trying to deliver an HRTF to the headphone and minimize the amount of variation in the HRTF due to the headphone transfer function on the human. So these are 2 models that tended to have low variation. An open back version, the K701, and the Dan Clark Audio Aeon 2 Noir. We also looked at how headphones measure on different test fixtures. So we had the standard Keymar, the B&K 5128, the Grass 45CA with Todd Welty's his original penna, based on all the measurements he did, and then the current Grass 45CA with the anthropomorphic pinna. And in this case, we weren't interested in the ear canal differences. We only were interested on the response up to the blocked ear canal. And we compared the measurements of those headphones compared to the humans. So the human measurements are the blue curves, and the green curves are sorry, yeah, the measurements on the test fixtures. So you can see in general that there's more leakage on the listeners, no, on the test fixtures. So the green is below the blue curve. So we're not measuring as much bass. And on the test fixtures, there's more high frequency energy. So what you will measure on a test fixture doesn't necessarily match what we were measuring on humans. And these are basically the average of those errors. Um, so depending on which test fixture you choose, you may get different results than how the headphone measures on a listener. Okay, so I just don't have too much time left. I just want to cover some more recent research. So in the last 5, 7 years, our industry has moved to a new standard in test fixtures. The ear couplers are different. Even the ear canals have changed. So most of the research we did was using the type 3.3 coupler. It's a cylindrical, very simple cylindrical shape coupler that is more or less simulates the acoustic impedance of an average ear. More recently, we have the type 4.3, which you can see is much more complicated in shape. It's a much more accurate representation of the shape of a human ear canal, and it's actually backed up by MRI images of listeners, over 50 people, and they've modeled and measured their ear canals, and they've tried to come up with an average acoustic impedance that represents this sample. And you can see here that there are differences between the type 3 and the type 4.3 in terms of the input impedance. And the question is, what effect does this have on the frequency response of a typical headphone? And you'll see that the highest impedances are at low frequencies. So you would expect to see the greatest differences at low frequencies and headphones that where the acoustic impedance is very high and similar to that of the ear simulators. So an example, a closed ear balanced armature headphone, for example, might be the worst case. And because of this new ear simulator, it's become very popular. What it means is that the Harman target curve, which was defined on this older type 3.3, means that the curve no longer applies if you're designing and testing headphones on these new test fixtures. Unfortunately, that got interpreted as the Harman target being dead. So what it really means is that you can't apply a curve defined on one standard when it's tested on a new standard. If you can come up with a translation or a new version for that test fixture, then the target isn't dead, or you can continue to measure it on the old fixture. And here's an example of a headphone that we tested on the old fixture. And measuring the same headphone on the new fixture, you can see that you get different results. And on the old fixture, you can say that this headphone's pretty compliant to the Harman target curve, and it has a calculated score of 83%. But if we tested it on this new fixture, it deviates quite a bit. And the calculated score is much lower, even though these two headphones sound identical, right? It's the same headphone. So in the last year, I worked on defining a target curve, the Harman target curve for this new test fixture. And you can download this paper. It's free if you want to read more about it. So the way I came up with this target curve, I measured 20 different in-ear headphones on the old fixture, measured it on the new fixture. And what we see are there's these differences for these 20 headphones varies depending on the model. What that means is that you can't simply take an average of these 20 headphones and apply that, because you need a different correction for each headphone. So what we did, we took the original headphone that we did all the research, and we measured it on both fixtures, and we came up with an average correction for that particular headphone. The blue curve is basically that new target. We compare that to the old target from the old fixture, and the red one is simply a smooth version of that target. We then did some listening tests where we had people evaluate this target compared to current targets, other targets that have been suggested. And I won't go too much into detail. The dotted curve, though, is what the current standard is, the diffuse field standard. So you can see these other targets tend to have more bass and a little less treble. So this is basically a standard Mushra test where people are, there's a 6 or 7 different headphones and they have to rate each one. And sometimes there's usually a hidden reference or an anchor in there as well. And the results were that this new target was equally preferred to this other target by a magazine called Sound Guys. The diffuse target, again, was the least preferred. And there was a couple of others that were slightly less preferred than these two here. Again, we found out that there were 2 segments. The vast majority fell into this segment, segment 1. We found that the largest segment tended to like both Harman Target and Sound Guys, and the smaller segment tended to like headphones that had less bass and more treble. So again, we see this trade-off between treble and bass. So, so anyways, this target allows people to design and review headphones using the Harman target on these new test fixtures, and we've done studies now to validate that it still produces good results. Finally, if you want to find out more information, a couple of years ago, I published a paper in Acoustics Today, which summarizes a lot of what I've discussed. And the other thing I want to say is that we just finished writing a 4th edition of the book that Floyd Toole wrote called Sound Reproduction. And there's now chapters added. There's 1 chapter added on headphones. And Todd Welty, my colleague, has added a very extended chapter on using subwoofers and to control and minimize room modes and interactions between subwoofers and room modes in rooms. So that's currently being edited and is expected to be released this fall. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it, and it's very interesting. I'm going to go to the Q&A, and we'll take a look. If anyone has any questions, please know you can submit your questions in the Q&A tab. Looks like we have one question here already. Is there a current tool that takes into account the transfer function of the ear canal to arrive at a target curve? I mean, how to maintain the quality for different ear textures and sizes?
Yeah, I mean that's an area of research that I didn't go into, but that is an area of active interest, and right now, where's my slides? I don't know if you can see that.
I'm not seeing your
Am I
screen.
showing?
Can you-
So I have to reshare it.
Yeah, yeah, try that. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, so it's true that everyone has different ear canals. These are the ear canals that were used to actually come up with the current Type 4.3 ear simulator. So they did MRIs and they made molds and so on. So there's and you can see that there's a lot of variations, especially above a kilohertz, where the length of the ear canal and the diameter can shift these resonances. Um, so the challenge is that how do you predict what those resonances are without putting a probe microphone at the person's eardrum? So there's been some work basically trying to model and predict what the response is at the eardrum. Samsung has been doing some work in this area. We've been doing some work in this area. And the ultimate goal is to use the microphone, for example, in an in-ear headphone, put out a test signal. And if you have an accurate model of electroacoustic model of the headphone, you can try to estimate what the response would be at the eardrum and then compensate for it. And the question is, what should that compensation be? Should it be the Harman target curve, or should it be what the response would be at your eardrum if you had an open ear and like a sound source, two speakers in front of you, for example? So it's very tricky, um, you know, coming up with an accurate model and then doing the research to figure out what that compensation should be. And that doesn't even account for differences maybe in your taste and your hearing loss and so on. So there's more than just your ear canal acoustics at play here and what you prefer. But I think that's an area that you're going to see more research, and I think there may actually be one or two products out that currently that claim that they compensate for this, but I don't think there's been any validation that they work.
Okay, wonderful. I'm just wondering, could you click continue to share just so we can get a better image of the geometries here? Okay. Uh, and another question here from Santiago. Are you planning to include other parameters besides frequency response?
Yeah, I mean, I think we published some papers where we looked at nonlinear distortion, and in one extreme case, it was a variable, but we did this study with Listen, who make measurement test equipment, and they had all these nonlinear metrics. And one in particular was pretty good at predicting distortion, but in general, when all these headphones were equalized to the same frequency response, and the only difference was the distortion, the differences were very small. And only affected two headphones. So apart from distortion, the only other variable really, I think, is spatial aspects. And I think a lot of that has to do with the recording. And if it happens to be a binaural recording or something that uses HRTFs, then really it comes down to which HRTF set are you using. Um, so right now, I think frequency response is the low hanging fruit. And if you get that right, you're well off, well on your way.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are decades more of research to come. You commented in the beginning of the presentation that, loudspeakers have been highly researched for many, many years, but a lot of this is seminal, so to speak. So um,
What
uh,
is seminal? The loudspeaker?
the no, a lot of this uh, headphone research
Yeah, I mean,
and
I think
putting the
I,
groundwork.
I think that I think people. I mean, Floyd Toole did a lot of the seminal work in loudspeakers back in the
Mhm.
'80s, and it took about 20 years. I think now there's consensus, there's standards, the CEA, ANSI standard for how to measure a speaker is pretty well standard. And you see it now being in standards like CEDIA, RS-22. So, but it took many years to reach consensus. And I think with headphones now, we're almost 12, 15 years. And there seems to be consensus on what it, the consensus that diffuse field is not the right one. Something like the
Mhm.
Harman produces good results, but there's still a lot of disagreement, I guess, on personalization. There seems to be people who think it needs to be personalized.
Yeah, yeah. One question that occurred to me, have you, in this research, considered changes in environmental conditions that could, a lot of folks are listening to these devices when they're on the train, on their commute, or if they're, walking through a park that's maybe next to a highway. And so does that change in background noise or even vibration impact the perception of a headphone and change where these preferences may lie?
Yeah, the people that have done the most research in that area, there's a lab in Denmark just outside Copenhagen called Sense Lab. And it's a lab that they do research, but they'll also do independent testing for you. So you can send your headphone there for a large sum of money and they'll benchmark it. And one of the things they do, they have a large database of recordings of different environments like bars and airports, and they will do listening tests of the headphone with and without ANC turned on, and evaluate the sound quality of speech and music under these different background noise levels. And they do show that there are differences in preference depending on the level of background noise and what it is. So this is something we haven't done. If the headphone has ANC, that might mitigate some of this, but certainly it's a factor. And all of our listening tests have been done in quiet environments.
Okay. From one of our committee members, Alejandro, do you think it would be relevant to complement the subjective evaluations with some objective variables such as sound quality in psychoacoustics or some other physiological parameter?
Uh, I don't know if I understand the question. Physiological being like measuring biosignals or like heart rate, or what do you mean by?
Yeah, I might ask Alejandro to clarify. Um, but I guess maybe thinking in terms of typical sound quality metrics, has there been any relation to um, and I'm sort of far disconnected to that field and field in like product design and things, but has there been any I guess summary metrics to be to be
So,
uh,
well, usually yeah, audio people define sound quality different than like noise and vibration people, right? Like
sure.
the sound quality of a door slamming is, you know, does it sound powerful or authoritative?
Hmm.
Uh, I guess the closest thing is, I mean, the traditional sound quality metrics are like roughness and sharpness, and head acoustics have something called MDAX, which is multi-dimensional quality scoring, and it's basically an automated way to. They've done jury testing of headphones and cars, and they've taken those jury ratings. They're untrained listeners, and then taken a binaural recording of the headphones or the car, and come up with sound metrics like timbre, immersion, distortion, and overall quality. And they They have a model that basically predicts these scores. I've not had an opportunity to use it and validate it, but if that's what you're referring to, there are people working on that. By the same token, Sense Lab also has something called Virtual Listening Panel, where you can go to their website and they take binaural recording of the headphone playing music and test signals, and in real time you can switch between different headphones, and the scores of these subjective scores will change over time depending on what the model is predicting. So there's
Mhm.
definitely work being done to automate the prediction of sound quality without reliance on listening tests.
Yeah. Um, I think we have time for one more question. From Thomas, is there a way to reduce the in your head experience of headphones?
Yeah, in-head localization, that's the big problem, and for some people it drives them nuts. Uh, like Floyd Toole won't listen to headphones because he doesn't like that. He did his PhD research on in-head localization, and other people, I read a study where they like the feeling because they feel very intimate, and when they're listening to podcasts, they having the person inside their head makes them feel very intimate, and they've shown that if you want to sell a product or sell your podcast, being inside their head will actually lead to greater sales. But it can be solved by using binaural processing, including reflections, just adding one or two reflections so that it appears that you're inside a real room, uh, can help a lot to get an externalized image. And generally speaking, the closer the set of HI, and if you have head tracking, of course, that helps get things outside your head.
Wonderful. Well, Sean, I really appreciate your time. We all appreciate it. We will have this up on YouTube for future viewing if that is acceptable by you, and
Mhm.
we'll look forward to uh, your future research, and this is all very exciting. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.